Hi, welcome everyone to the webinar on Access to Remedy today. Good to see some familiar names in the list and happy that you're joining us this afternoon and maybe for you morning, evening, and have time for the subject of Access to Remedy. This is the second webinar we're organizing after our trainings, and it's connected to the local expert network, and we're happy to share more insight on Access to Remedy today, as requested by you while filling in the polls we sent out. As you know, this webinar is related to our sectoral agreement on responsible business conduct for the food sector. There are many participants in this agreement, of which some will today have their presentations, and we are welcoming you to join us this afternoon. My name is Eva Smulders, and I work for CNV Internationaal. I'm an expert in business and human rights, and mainly focus my work on multi-stakeholder initiatives, and that's why I will be facilitating today this webinar. The goal of today is introduction on access to remedy from different perspectives. I will give more a global introductory refresher, to state it like that. But I invited also Seljan, and Marike was also invited in the morning, and we made a recording, and she will discuss it from more another stakeholder perspective of the standard of RSPO in the palm oil sector. And later on, I would like you to join us to share your ideas as an expert facilitator, locally present, what you can do to improve complaint mechanisms and the remedy process for the victims. And we have one question for you, just to know our audience a bit more. And we would like you to answer the question from which country you are joining us. Okay, thank you. So we are a very mixed group. We will ask you to shut down the microphones again. And if you have a question, you can always switch it on again. The agenda of today, like I said, I will give a short introduction, probably some repetition of the trainings we already gave, or in your country or in your region, or you already saw them online. But I will have some highlights on access to remedy. And then we invite two specialists. One, Seljan, she will give more an introduction from a company perspective, as she's dealing with a lot of companies that are trying to improve their remedies and their complaint mechanisms, trying also to fulfill on the OECD requirements, and she has quite some knowledge to share. And then we have a short movie from Marike we recorded in this morning on Solidaridad from the perspective from the RSPO, so from the palm oil sector. And then we would like to ask you to think about your role now and in the future on this matter. Just to continue, as I said, I will give a short introduction, and as you know, we always started all our trainings with two main frameworks, and the first one is the United Nations Guiding Principles. As you know, the guiding principles have three pillars, and one is, of course, the state's duty to protect. We talked about that a lot already. What is their role in this? And that's where there's rules and regulations in every country to protect its citizens. But second, there's also a duty to respect from the corporate sector. So companies have a responsibility to respect human rights and address adverse impacts. And the third pillar is completely focused on the access to effective remedy. And that could be judicial or non-judicial, and it's all about the victims of business-related human rights abuse. And this pillar is like, we see it growing in strength and in importance, firstly because there's new legislation coming up in the EU, but also we see it in countries outside the EU. There's a lot of going on also in Japan, in Australia, and of course the United States already has some legislations regarding child labor and forced labor. And we see also that there are more and more companies interested and evolving and acting on their own due diligence And they know that, and also access to effective remedy is part of it, because they know their risks, they know there can be some negative impacts, and if they occur, they have to remediate it. And why do I say they have to? Because when you follow the 6 steps of the OECD guidelines, it's all about your own management. It's about identifying the risks, how to prevent and mitigate them, track, communicate, and yes, number 6, provide for or cooperate in remediation and where appropriate. So you have to deal with the effects of your company's management and of your conduct, and adverse impacts should be remediated. In which strength, etc., that depends on your own actions and your involvement. I will come back to that later on. But what is meant with the remedy? It's when individuals or groups that have been harmed by business activities, they have a right to remedy and to restore to the situation they have been before the impacts have occurred. So they have to, you have to see what damage is done and restore to the situation before that. That's not always possible in a strict case. I mean, sorry, if somebody his leg is pulled off because of an accident, you can't put it on again. It's a very, maybe a rough example, but how do you restore? It's all, and that makes it very complicated. It's every case is different, and every remediation can be different and should be different according to the impact you had. That's why you have various measures, and you have very different types of grievance mechanisms, and that's where we're going to talk about later. If we think of grievance mechanisms, we for ourselves are separated in the axis. Do victims or workers, in our case as a trade union, have access to a grievance mechanism? How is the process, and how is it remediated? Was it effective? And even you can put a 4th step here, the monitoring, because you can remediate, but did you also take care of what caused it? Did you make sure that when it happened, it can't happen again? So you remediate one person, but should also have effect on your systems of working. What are other aspects of a good complaint mechanism? It should be legitimate. It should be equitable, so for everybody accessible. And the accessibility should be also, think about language. Think about, you have very good complaint mechanism you can use on your phone, but if somebody can't afford to buy the data, they can't even access it. It should be transparent, that for whom it is, how it works, what is the process. And it could be or should be a source of learning, not only for the victim, but especially for the company itself. What went wrong? What do I have to improve in my processes, in my own management? Predictable does mean that you should have, that people, when they file a complaint, they know what next steps are occurring, they know what to expect. And it could be that it takes a long time, but if you are communicating about the process, they are aware of it. It should be rights compatible. It means that a lot of non-judicial systems should not be against the local national law, because then you have to fight between 2 systems. So it should be all aligned. And we always state that it's based on engagement and dialogue. The best remediation and the fastest is when the victim and the company are in dialogue and solve the issue, instead of going into a stronger, heavier complaint mechanism, building it up, for example, to a brand in Europe. If you're following all those steps, it's better to have it remediated at the factory floor, we believe. These are different types of grievance mechanisms. You can find them in a lot of literature and theory. You have the state-based, like we said, courts, arbitration. It's based on labor law, on other laws that are applicable in your country. Then non-judicial grievance mechanism, that's more on the human rights institutionals and national contact point that exist in many countries. And then we have a non-state-based grievance mechanism, like I said before, that could be from a brand or from a company level, or like we are also, and Seljan will also share more on that, from multi-stakeholder mechanisms. So like we have the agreements in the apparel, they had their own grievance mechanisms that could be followed. And then this TAFI, yeah, I think you had it all already in other trainings or you've seen it before in other literature. If there's impact, a company can be seen as causing it when it's directly on their, for example, an accident which is occurring on their factory floor. It's caused by the enterprise if they don't have a good cleaning up system, for example. But it could also be contributed to. If you offer as a company a very low price, this could relate to working too many hours at your supplier. And then you're contributing to people working too many hours, overtime, etc., long shifts. And directly linked, I always say it's a bit step further, but it's not about distance. I was corrected yesterday, but your influence is often a bit less, and it's, for example, you're transporting containers and what is happening on the ship. How much you're directly linked because you are connected to it in your value chain, but your influence and it's further away, so your leverage often is also a bit less. Causing by you should and you can also remediate the impact directly because you can seize or prevent it, but you also have to remediate it. When you're contributing, sometimes you have a lot of influence, so you can contribute to the remedy, but sometimes you can only use your leverage to encourage this remedy as a company. And in the last one, you should try to influence the entity by conversation and talking about the adverse impacts that you are aware of and that you're worried about it, and try to remediate the impact. All this theory can be found a lot more better explained in several webinars and also in a lot of books and literature. But for now, I think this is enough. What we found when doing a research in the apparel sector, not in the food, I'm sorry, we really found out that you should focus on strengthening local mechanisms. Thinking of the victim, they are most helped when they're remediated the fastest. And how can you remediate the fastest? By using local mechanisms and not go to court in Geneva, for example. You should track the complaints because you can learn from it. By the unions, for example, then they have a case to negotiate later, but also track it by a company or by a brand because then you know what is happening and where the risks are. Fast routes, the earlier the remedy, the better, because if somebody's fired and it comes 2 years later, often the company can't even track the person because they are already 2 factories further down the road or maybe in another province. Promote alternative ways of structuring complaint mechanisms. It's all now very much linked and heavy situated, and we should look for more flexible ways of complaint mechanisms. I know that some companies are already trying to have it easier and lighter. And very, very important, and I know Marike will come back to that too, is the issue of retaliation. In some countries, we have freedom of association is not normal. We know that a lot of workers, when they file a complaint, they're not safe and it can lose their jobs. There are a lot of cases of that. So make it possible to do a complaint anonymously. And for us, we always say social dialogue is still essential. Social dialogue is key, and the CBAs are a good instrument to assure fair labor conditions, but that's more interest-based from the worker perspective. And here we are talking a lot more on the rights-based. And the rights-based is that access to remedies and complaint mechanisms, unfortunately, are still needed because freedom of association is not always respected. There's a lot of fundamental rights at work, and but not always recognized. Not all CBAs are negotiated in a tripartite or bipartite way, so still the interests are not secured at least, and there's no, we still should work on complaints and voluntary to binding. We see that there are more and more human rights due diligence done. That's voluntary, but we also see legislation coming up. And with the legislation, there should be also good monitoring. And the more complaints there are, the better we know that what works and what still has to be improved and which risks still have to be addressed. So for us, we believe in the negotiation, in the dialogue, but we know that sometimes access to remedy is still needed to solve right-based issues. For now, that was my part of this presentation. Please, I want to ask you to go back to the Slido again and tell me if you have any experience with or state-based judicial system mechanisms, non-judicial state-based mechanisms, multi-stakeholder or standards like certificates of mechanisms, or non-state company level mechanisms that you filed a complaint or at least you know about or you heard about. I just would like to know which experience is there within our local expert network. Please fill in the poll and we will see what it results in. And later you can ask your questions if you wish. So most people are familiar with non-state multi-stakeholders mechanisms and some with non-state company level mechanisms. This means that within our network, there's not a lot of experience of filing complaints through the legal system of your nation or your country, if I read it like this. Here it states that most of is non-state and not through the national law. That's how I read these answers. Oh, I hear that there's a question in the chat. I'm opening. How do you assess purchasing practices, including price paid to yeah, for example, if a company pays a price which does not contribute to a living income, this leads to other human rights. I think, Constantine, you're already answering it partly because of telling us that if the price is that low, that people are not having cannot have a living income, if I understand you well. We always call this as a contribution because it's not directly causing it. How do you? The assessment is done based on the dialogue you have with the company, and more and more we know that in certain standards it's already asked about the salaries that are paid to the workers. For example, in RSPO and Bonsucro, this was part of the standard. And then you know if there's a gap with, for example, the local living wage. So that's a way to know. But because certain standards are picking this up, we also know, for example, there's a salary matrix made. And I think in the bananas, they're doing a lot of research now, how far it is from the living wage. When you know the wage is paid, a trade union or a worker or an NGO or another organization can base its dialogue with the companies on this wages paid. So the more we know about the wages, which is more and more publicly asked, the more you can go into the dialogue. We go to the next slide, and I want to invite Dr. Sayan Verdieva-Smeet from the SER to tell us more about the challenges and opportunities on remediation and grievance mechanisms. She has quite a lot of experience within the sector agreements, but also from other assignments she had on what is working, how it's working, and which challenges she still sees, and the opportunities for the future. So, Sayan, please enlighten us.
Thank you very much, Eva, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, colleagues. I'm happy to be here. As Eva mentioned, I work at SER. SER's Social-Economic Council is actually the advising body of the Dutch government and parliament. As part of our work, we are already familiar with the food sector agreement, but we are also facilitating a number of other sectoral agreements which try to improve responsible business conduct in different sectors. And through these sectoral agreements, we are quite in close contact with companies who try to improve their remediation and grievance mechanisms. So today in this presentation, I want to talk about a bit about company perspective. Also focus on the current challenges faced by the companies when it comes to remedy and when it comes to grievance mechanisms. I want to focus a bit about the emerging good practices, and in the end, I would like to share a few thoughts how you as experts can take part in this process and what available resources are out there. To begin with, first of all, I think it's also important to mention that when it comes to company complaint mechanisms, it's important to identify there's two different things: the grievance mechanism or complaint mechanism that are related to companies' own activities, and the grievance mechanisms when it comes to the company's supply chain. The first one, the grievance mechanism, which are for the company's own workers, for companies' consumers, for companies' direct stakeholders. That's already, when we look at different sectors, companies have already quite experience in building those processes in place. But when it comes to supply chain, that's a relatively new concept for companies. And what we are witnessing, that even the multinational big companies, they're having quite a lot of challenges in understanding how they can build a successful grievance mechanism for their supply chain. And the further down the supply chain it goes, if you look at the direct suppliers, for example, several sectors, they have successful grievance mechanisms, but when it goes further down the chain, it's getting more and more difficult. The second thing, I think it's also important to note that when we're talking about the company grievance mechanism, we tend to think that there's one channel, but in reality, many companies are actually having different channels through which complaints of the stakeholders are received. This can be, for instance, you can have your grievance mechanism for your supply chain, but you also can receive grievances when you do the audits or when you go and have stakeholder engagement with different NGOs or human rights defenders or communities. You receive this knowledge through it can be from the through different news pieces or the NGO reports and etc. So there's actually quite different channels through which complaints are received within the company. And when you look at the company itself, there are also different processes in place. They can be, for example, the whistleblower or ethics hotlines or the speak up policies or the trade unions or etc. So there are actually, in reality, there's quite a lot of channels. Even when we look at the companies, for example, a company like Amazon, what they do is, for example, in one sector, they are part of a collective grievance mechanism. In another sector, they have built their own supply chain grievance mechanism. In another country, they do something else. So the grievance mechanisms sometimes are also different from country to country, from the product to product. So it can actually get quite complex. And lastly, and I think it's also related to the question in the chat, what we see nowadays compared to what we were seeing, for example, a few years ago, receiving complaints is also becoming a part of the due diligence process. So the companies are trying to actually change their practices based on the grievances that they receive. Previously, it was more and more like a standalone activities. Like, yes, we receive a complaint, we remedied it, and then move on. But nowadays, we are starting to have conversations. What's the root cause of this problem? What do I need to change in order not to have this systematic problem again? So this is more regarding the emerging practice in that field. Moving forward, the challenge when it comes to that companies are facing nowadays, I can also differentiate the challenge with regards to remedy and challenge with regards to grievance mechanism. And I think the biggest challenge is that companies starting to think about remedy only after the negative impact occurs. For instance, you start a project, and only when the project has negative impact on communities and communities complain about it, companies start to think, okay, what kind of remedy can I offer? What is my processes in place? And that's different. For example, if you start a project, normally the companies would go a lot of financial planning. They will talk about the financial consequences if the project fails and etc. But this is not happening on the remedy front. And that's something that we are trying to work with companies, that you need to be prepared in advance whenever you start a new project, or when you start a new process or product, or you're active in one country, you need to start thinking prior what kind of negative impact this can happen at the people, environment, biodiversity, and what can I do? What am I prepared to do? What are my options? Do I need to start cooperating with the local NCPs or the state organs, or do I need to start building the community grievance mechanism, or what are my options? So this kind of thoughts need to be actually started to be identified early as possible. The second thing that we are seeing, that companies are really struggling to understand their relationship to the impact. So when it comes to their own activities, it's easier to understand. So if I caused, I will remedy the impact. But when it comes to your supply chain, not always there's this transparency to understand your role, whether you are the contributing or whether you are linked to. And it also gets more complicated because being contributing to an impact and being linked to an impact is not a fixed process. It changes. One day you can be linked to an impact, and another day you are contributing to an impact. For instance, a textile company, a textile brand in Netherlands, let's say, buys products from a supplier in Asia, and that supplier has two production lines. In one line, there's no breach of labor rights. In another line, there's severe breach of labor rights. So we would say that the company here is not contributing to it because its production line is clean. But this is a relative concept. So tomorrow, in 5 months, in 1 year, that labor right breach can also get into your own production line as well. So you need to be prepared to that effect. And that brings to another challenge, and that's that many companies that we work with sometimes also come to us and say, hey, there's this impact in my supply chain, but I can't do anything about it. I'm not causing it. I'm not directly contributing to it, and I don't have leverage. I'm such a small player. What can I do? And we always tell them that just because you don't have leverage doesn't mean that you don't have to do anything. You still have a responsibility. If you don't have leverage, you need to build that leverage. So your activities should be on how can I build that leverage. And the multi-stakeholder agreements or the industry initiatives are one way of building that leverage. And in a bit, I will also talk about other supply chain platforms that can also help companies to build those kind of leverages. Another challenge is that sometimes, and most of the times, the negative impact of the company activities is further away the supply chain. So it's done by the third parties, and what we see that those third parties do not always have capacity, resources, or understanding and commitment to remedy. While the companies here, they have the knowledge and capacity, but they're not because they're not causing or contributing to it. They just they're not taking the responsibility. And what we are working with companies to explain that remediation is a shared responsibility. You need to help your suppliers to strengthen their own systems, and your suppliers need to strengthen the grievance mechanism or remediation process of their own suppliers. You can do that, for example, by giving trainings. You can do that by building awareness, you can give resources, you can help them to improve their systems. And we are happy to see that there are some also good practices in there. For example, a few weeks ago, we had this company, Chibo, in one of the webinars, and they were talking about how they've built this relationship with their suppliers, when they encourage their suppliers to strengthen their grievance mechanism. And they say that, look, we're not going to stop our relationship with you just because you're receiving complaints. Actually, we encourage you to receive complaints. It means that your grievance mechanism is working. And we can work with you as long as we see that we are also working to solve those problems and remedy. And which brings me to another point that sometimes we also hear from companies that I have a grievance mechanism, but no one is actually coming to me with complaints. And the reason of that is not because you don't have any complaints in your activities or your supply chain. The reason is that there's either stakeholders are not aware of it or they don't trust it. So not using or not lodging complaints does not necessarily mean that you are very good in your processes. It just means that your grievance mechanism is not working. Having talked about some of the challenges, I also wanted to focus a bit about emerging good practices. I think Eva already mentioned about legislation. What we are seeing that the national and regional legislation on due diligence is actually having a good motivation for companies to strengthen their own processes. That's especially true because we see that, for example, in big companies, sustainability managers, they understand the concept, the importance, but it can sometimes be too bureaucratic and too difficult to sell this idea to the other departments or to your management. So having a sound due diligence legislation really helps on that. The second thing, what we are seeing is we're seeing very good examples of companies building or using their leverage through collaborations. For instance, we saw one example of a textile company who used its leverage on its suppliers in order to remedy the situation in one of the sub-suppliers. And in that process, they also, for example, they intervened with different stakeholders. They used the governments, they used the NGOs. So they involved a lot of other stakeholders to remedy a situation happening in one of the factories in Cambodia. So that's something that we are seeing more and more, that companies understanding that when it comes to supply chain, being on your own does not work. You need to have the collaborations. And I think in 5-10 years, that's going to be actually ordinary business of the day. Another good practice that we are seeing is global framework agreements. Those are basically the agreements between the international corporations and the global trade unions. They involve provisions on labor rights and how to respect the labor rights, but they also have several provisions on dispute resolution and how the trade unions can bring complaints against global corporation and how they could be solved through dialogue and mediation. There are about 50 of them. You can find them online, but a good example of it would be probably the one from H&M that has quite a lot of substance in it. Community grievance mechanisms, that's a good practice that we are recently seeing in the mining and extractive sector. For instance, I'm leading the sectoral agreement for renewable energy, and there one of the wind turbine manufacturers, Vestas, has such a community grievance mechanism. What they've done is they've put different channels for receiving complaints within communities in the projects where they produced wind turbines. This sometimes are just post boxes where the community members can lodge their complaints. Sometimes it's the telephones, sometimes it's the email. It's a combination of having complaint handlers on the ground, which talk with the community members. So those are the examples that we are seeing. In some instances, for example, companies like Wilmar or companies like Hermes, they also use independent third parties to have this kind of remediation processes to ensure the neutrality and objectivity of this process. And as I mentioned, multi-point mechanisms, those are also becoming more and more common. In these mechanisms, there are several channels through which complaints are received within the company, but the company has one standard department who looks at them and makes sure that the remedy is consistent and that the company's due diligence processes are adjusted to reflect this process. Further, what kind of role you can help if you look at from the company perspective, local experts are always needed for stakeholder engagement. And when I say stakeholder engagement, I mean, first of all, in the design of the grievance mechanism, but also in the functioning of the grievance mechanism. So what we always recommend to companies that you don't build a grievance mechanism and then go to workers. You involve them from the beginning and build a grievance mechanism that suits their needs. So local experts can always be helpful in that. The second thing is about awareness raising activities and trainings. So once the grievance mechanism is out there, it's also important to build awareness in the communities and workers about the existence of this mechanism. Even the most successful complaint mechanism, for example, International Accord on Textile, they on a yearly basis, they have tens of different trainings and awareness raising activities that they do in order to make sure that everyone is aware of this channel. And the third role is complaint handling and mediation. Company grievance mechanism should be on dialogue and mediation, and they need people on the ground to check the case merits, to mediate between the worker and between the company, between the supplier, between different stakeholders of the complaint. So in that sense, experts can play a role. And lastly, about monitoring of the results. So this is about monitoring whether the complainant is satisfied with the remedy, but it's also monitoring how is the grievance mechanism is functioning and how is this remedy that the problem that was the root cause, is it being handled? Is there a solution to it, or is there different complaints coming from the regarding the same matter, or maybe the community members are afraid of raising this? So this kind of monitoring can be a part. Lastly, how can we help? So what are out there that can help you if you would like to learn more about it? As you already know, we are facilitating a number of sectoral agreements. And as part of those sectoral agreements, we work with companies, NGOs, trade unions, and government on different due diligence steps, including access to remedy. And sometimes we also provide guidelines on those, and those are also available online and public. Secondly, webinars on access to remedy. This year we are organizing 4 webinars together with GIZ. 2 of them has already been taken place. Another 2 is coming later this year. Those are giving really examples of how companies are dealing with these problems, not only the good practices, but also the challenge and where they need more assistance. And lastly, I also want to emphasize Open Supply Hub. That's a supply chain mapping platform through which companies can put information about their suppliers online. And that can be very beneficial on the one hand, for NGOs, for communities, for the human rights defenders, if they see a negative impact on the ground associated with a certain factory or supplier, they can also check through Open Supply Hub if that factory is linked to a brand in the Netherlands or anywhere else in the world, so that to flag that issue with them. And the brands can use it to also seek who else is sourcing from those suppliers if they want to build leverage and use that leverage to remedy the situation. I'm going to stop here. You can ask questions to me, and also if you have questions later, you can always contact me through email. Thank you.
Yep. Thank you, Seljan. We continue with a short question from my side. Please open the Slido again. And could you, this is like a preparation for the next presentation, name a standard or certification scheme you are aware of, and if you think they have a complaint mechanism in place. So please name a standard or certification scheme which you think or know that has a complaint mechanism in place. No certificate. Then I can name a couple, like I know about RSPO, that's where the next movie is about, but I also know that Bonsucro has one, Fair Trade has, I think there are a lot of other mechanisms or certification schemes in place in the food sector that you can file a complaint, but also in other sectors it's known and it's coming up more and more. The more multi-stakeholder initiatives are there, you see more of these mechanisms in place. And it really helps to solve issues, to know about issues, to improve the situation. And that's why we want to go to the next. It's a movie we recorded this morning because Marieke was very, very busy, but we recorded during the first session, and we will show it to you with her presentation.
Thanks, Eva. Can you bring, yeah, great. Can you also click through, because I'm not sure if that works. I'll be very rapid. Like, next slide, please. Thank you. So my name is Marieke Leegwater. I work for Solidaridad, an international civil society, and I'm also member of the RSPO complaints panel since 2013 already. So I'm sorry, I have to leave at 12. I can have slightly, let's say, maybe 5 minutes more, but that's the max. So I'll tell you a little bit about the RSPO complaints mechanisms, and maybe it's of help. And in the end, there's all links to more information. And I'll be really quick, so please follow me. I hope, bear with me. So RSPO complaints system is a mechanism to handle and address complaints against RSPO members. They can be submitted by all organizations, member, non-members, individual organizations, anything. And they can be submitted when somebody thinks an RSPO certified company is not acting in line with RSPO key documents. So maybe I'm now realize RSPO is Roundtable for Sustainable Palm Oil. So this is all relevant for the palm oil sector. So when a complaint is submitted, it's handled by the RSPO Secretariat in combination with a complaints panel according to a very tight process where steps are clearly defined and actors have specific roles. Next slide, please. Thank you. So this is a process flow, and you can also find that online. It's really relevant. Timelines are defined for, let's say, what happens after submission, reception. There's an initial diagnosis stage. Then it's looked at, our key rules breached if the case is true. So, and this you can also find online. Next slide, please. So to date, there have been 149 complaints since 2009. 163 are closed and 31 are open. All cases that are open and also the closed ones can be found in the RSPO case tracker, and you can find all documents there. Next slide, please. So previous, yes, this one, learnings. Eva asked me for learnings. I've been in a panel for 10 years now. So lessons I would draw by now. It's really important to clearly define procedures, timelines, and responsibility. I think before 2017, RSPO didn't really have that. So in 2017, the CAP, Complaints and Appeals procedures, was adopted. And that really improved the procedures and the process, and it really clearly defines everything. It's really important to organize impartial budget so that, in our case, the complaints panel can decide when do we need an independent investigation, and there are resources for that. And it's important that the panel or the group has a clear and strong, let's say, enforcement authority or power. So, for example, in RSPO context, companies by now are really fearful when the certification license is suspended. They feel very threatened. Their value is threatened. So that leads to a very desire to act. And this system is really helping to drive improvements because as complaints panel, we often decide things like, your certification is suspended and it can be lifted when these following actions are complied with. So X is a list of actions. And we see, and then we ask companies for quarterly reporting against that action list. And we really see that helps them to be really committed on their improvements. In our panel, we now, over the years, found that sometimes we struggle with how does it work with legal systems, how do we interfere with that, and what happened in the certification procedure. So another learning is that legal and certification knowledge and expertise in the panel is really helpful. And finally, it's important to think about transparency. So when is a case made public? Next slide, please. So I think, when I thought about learnings, I also realized as RSPO, we also still have a lot of challenges. And that is like accessibility. So how do we ensure that remote groups can also access the system? Because, we have a strong feeling that only the tip of the iceberg reaches the system. And another thing is quite rapidly you enter into troubles around communities that don't really, have access to good reading skills. And so how do you make sure that communities have the resources to really understand that, they can act upon and understand what the companies are required to do and how they can, make use of their rights. Another challenge is the protection of the identity or the anonymity of the complainant. So sometimes complainants want to remain anonymous, and we need to protect that in our systems, and that can really be quite challenging sometimes, but that's a thing I think RSPO also needs to work on. And the other issue is what we call in RSPO context is frivolous complaints. So we see that there's an opportunity for NGOs to start complaints, and then, they can enter into a negotiation with the company, and then they have kind of a pressure point to say, if you do this, we withdraw the complaint. And often, that involves a payment of the company. And that is a bit of a, let's say, upcoming business model that we seem to recognize, and that I don't think is a really good development. And it's a bit of so we need to think how do we make sure that if there are real issues that NGOs bring up, they are not kind of easily parked because an NGO is paid, something like that. So next slide, please. So here I put all links to more information. So all the documents around RSPO complaints process can be really well found online. Or, for example, who's in the RSPO complaints panel and how that works, the RSPO case tracker. And I think I put also there for you a presentation that's held in RSPO RT last year. with learnings on one particular NGO, a complaint case in palm oil that lasted, I think, for, I would say, 30 years, I think, and that was eventually brought to a close. And it contains really, I think it's a short slide deck, but it's really inspiring, I think, to look at and learn. Next slide, please. So thank you so much for your attention. I hope this was useful. Final note, the complaints panel meets every month, and sometimes we had ad hoc people, and it absolutely needs more people, in particular social NGO representatives. So any body that would think, I want to learn about this and contribute, please make yourselves known to the RSPO Secretariat, and we'll be happy to receive your application if you want to support and join us in the palm sector with handling of complaints. Thank you very much. Thank you, Eva. I need to run now to another meeting, and I hope you have a good rest of the session. Bye-bye.
That was Marieke this morning, and she feels she was in a rush, but we go to you and your role in the future. As you are aware, we are finalizing our project with all the other organizations on the local expert network. We have a final meeting the 6th of July, but we don't want it to be the final of our work. So we are working a lot together with the SER, together with the government, to see if this local expert network can stay as a network and to be accessible for companies with questions that are doing risk assessments, that are doing evaluations, that want to have more stakeholder involvement, maybe a focus group analysis, etc. So therefore, we have a question to you all, guys, regarding access to remedy, regarding complaint mechanisms. What do you think you can offer, facilitate, do the coming 3 to 5 years, and also your experience, of course, right now, that is of interest to companies here or in the EU, and maybe of interest for us, so we can also take that into account when writing a proposal and telling companies about this local expert network and the richness of capacities and knowledge there is present at local level. So please write down which role you can play to make sure negatively affected workers and communities are remediated. What is that you can offer the coming years? I'm just going to read them and ask a question if I don't understand it completely. Sensitizing workers on grievance mechanism, how they can access remediation. Due diligence on communities, yes. I think we also saw that in the morning, that it's very important that workers know about their rights. And also the next one, monitoring of remediation action. If remediation takes place, it should be seen, one, if it's done properly, so the case itself, but two, also that the cause of the grievance is also being addressed. So it's a double monitoring role I think there is locally to do. Training orientation for the access to stay. Yes, like we said in the beginning, we didn't hear a lot about the state level channels, but there are. Of course, there are local laws. There's collaboration with the Ministry of Labor, or a different one that is in charge of checking if everybody is acting according to the law. And I think there is still a lot to learn on that level. Trade unions and the lobby to companies, lobby to the processors, lobby to governments, but also we do a lot of lobby to the brands here, and we can use your input with the cases you observe. Yes, if there's an action plan on companies, or through an audit, but also through making their human rights due diligence work and having their action plan, yes, we should have a participation of the people on the ground.
Yeah. And
Yep,
if
Dineke.
I may add
Yeah.
something, Dineke de
course.
Groot coordinate, also sensitizing indigenous people,
Yeah.
because we focus now a lot in our chats on workers, which is very good, of course, but there are also a very big group of stakeholders which don't have a say and belong to indigenous groups who also have their rights and on whose rights are how would you say, violated in many ways, taking their grounds and all kind of things.
Yep.
So you could also help them.
Yep.
And lobby for them to regional and local governments.
Yes. Thank you, Dineke. That's really of help. And what I know that especially also in the mining, that's always a lot of communities affected around it. And we see that, I'm going to speak almost Spanish already. And we see that these communities, when affected, need help and support to facilitate this. So we also think that apart from this food agreement, there are more agreements coming up with a lot of effect on local communities. So it's good to be aware of that.
It's not only mining, it's also in the palm sector.
Of course,
Those grounds, lands.
Yeah. Generar conocimientos y capacidades en las organizaciones sindicales. Yes, we need more knowledge on trade unions, knowledge and capacities, how this works and how you can add a complaint, but also we need more data. I think the trade unions can have a huge role of compiling, and if collaborating different trade unions in one sector, for example, the palm oil, but it could also be in mining, and having this data on the grievances that are affecting workers or communities, we can use this data to file a complaint or make it known to companies here in the Netherlands or in Europe. A lot of workers, and again, the remediation assessment. How is it done? Is it done properly? Can we work with it? Yes. This helps us a lot. And with this, I would also like to start closing the session, or are there more? Oh, there's someone typing, I'm sorry, and in the chat. Yeah. I see my role will be to provide technical guidance and capacity building as well as assist in both judicial and non-judicial remedies. Yeah, through the Ministry of Labour. Some of you have contacts directly with the Ministry of Labour, and I think the facilitation and the non-judicial, but the contacts you have there are of huge value, because a lot of companies, at least more downstream in Europe, don't know how it works, don't know the local or the national law, and don't have the contacts that are needed. So I'm very happy that this is mentioned again about the ministries. We often forget, talking with brands here, that there's just a legal system already in place. And again, that's national, that's local, and often that can be faster if applied well. And then the indicators on the information produced by trade. Yes, that's what I was talking about. The more data we have, and try to have the similar data, because that's often complicated, because we all collect data, but it can be that it's not really compatible. We can have cases built because based on different data from different angles, NGOs, syndicates, community workers, and how to compile that. That's also a very interesting role you can have, and maybe from a project-wise approach. Another one in the chat. That one I already answered. Yeah, yeah. No problem. Yeah, one in Spanish. It says, el reto es generar confianza. How can we achieve that there's trust to build on the due diligence and have an independent people add in this process? This is about the stakeholders' engagement. And this, how can you play a role that of like intermediate between the company and the workers and the communities, so this trust building is taking place. I think that's a very nice answer and a very important one. We lived that the last 5 years in the sectoral agreement. The first 2 years we were like to the left and the right, and it took 3 to 5 years to really build that trust. And this is here in Europe, in the Netherlands, but of course it's also needed on the ground. There's still a lot of debate going on. You have different approaches, you have different objectives, but you have to come into this dialogue phase, and therefore you need trust, and that takes a lot of time.
Yeah, and also to add to this, it's very important to combine different roles. You don't have to do all the same things, but when you have a common goal, you can help one another from different angles. And one can play the bad guy, the other can put the carrots, and together you reach and also respect one another's roles. And
sound back. Oh, there's another one in the chat. One real challenge is the power relation between workers and employers. In many sites, using complaint systems leads to retaliation or loss of a job. Yes, and we need to know the cases, because this is something, we mentioned it before, it should be possible to do it anonymously. We all know the picture of the complaint box just below the desk of the manager. I mean, that will never work. This box will be empty forever. And it's strange, it's still happening. And yes, we are lobbying, advocating that you should file a complaint anonymously. We had a lot of problems, even in the Netherlands there, with the fact that retaliation is going on. But we need to be aware of it. Marike mentioned it, I mentioned it, I'm completely agreeing with that. So that's our role also, to advocate that this is possible, or to have a complaint in name of. And that's often still not possible, and we are trying that complaint mechanisms, when new or when set up by a company, it has that possibility. Otherwise, yes, not all complaints will be filed. Definitely not. We are aware of it. Very good to raise it again and again. The set on paper is the most effective way to...
The formal mechanisms as set on paper are not the most effective ways.
So maybe I don't know what's meant with the last comment. Maybe we can give the mic to Constantine. Can you please elaborate? Can you tell us what you mean with the last remark, please?
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes, very good. Loud and clear.
Yes, it's just related to the power differentials that in practice, like the company level formal mechanisms are not the practical way that workers are not the way workers feel more trust or confidence to raise any complaints. In many cases, because I work a lot with farm level workers, they don't have this practice, or this locally, it's not accepted to use these formal mechanisms, especially when they don't trust or they don't understand or they don't feel represented within these mechanisms. So I feel it's very important what you said before about building these processes together with workers, and workers' representatives being part of the process of receiving mechanisms and following up on complaints. Not only these mechanisms should have representation both from the management, from the company, but also from local level workers, so that they are more accessible and more confidence and trust to use them.
Thank you. Yes, I get your point, and it's all about accessibility, but also about what we were talking about before is that if you have a complaint mechanism, it is the duty of the company to have one, but they can ask in a dialogue with the workers if it works, and then they should improve. We think the company has the responsibility to have a good complaint mechanism that's accessible, transparent, and solves the issue. And we know that a lot isn't working, so they should have a dialogue with the workers how to improve it, how it works better. We were talking about it in a training just 2 days ago. Anything else? I think one participant is typing, and yes, I also agree that the formal mechanism is not always working, so maybe you also have examples of more informal dialogues first to solve the issue. Like we said, the more it can be solved locally, the better. And often the formal ones are very heavy, very formal, especially if it comes from brands in Europe, for example, then it's made by lawyers here instead of on the ground with the workers. And that is something we are advocating for, to have it locally organized. There's still somebody typing, and I'm wondering what comes up, because I really would like to have everything at least dealt with or received, but I think we're almost going to wrap up. Yes. Otherwise, this will also be shared. We will give a small report on the webinar. We will take this input also to the projects we are formulating and to the talks we have with brands, with the government here, with the SER, because it helps. Ah, there it is. Yes, it's not an easy topic, and you have to have the knowledge and experience, and I think that's why we also hear that we can share it. Then we should train also syndicates, but sometimes you also need an expert to help with the case if you really want to put it on a legal matter, or to, like we did, first the European Union or to other systems. Then it is a case and you have to build it, and you need specialized approach and special knowledge of experts. Yep, I agree with that. And we have some in this group, I know, and thank you for this. Yeah. With this, we take it forward. Maybe it comes back also on the 6th as a matter, but we also have other topics on the 6th, and I want to invite you to join us the 6th if you didn't already subscribe. And also want to invite you, and we will send you that, to the other 2 webinars that are coming up on Access to Remedy that go a lot further in detail with a lot more theory and experiences from other sides, from other sectors. We will keep you posted when they are. Seljan will send me the details. And of course, again, subscribe to the online event together with the companies on the 6th of July. I will call it a meet and greet, but it's that companies are getting used to having local experts, know that they exist, and see how we can help each other and work together to improve the situation on the ground, because that's our main goal. Thank you so much. Thank you. Marieke is already left, but Seljan, thank you so much for your help and for your presentation. It was very clear. We will share all the presentations, all the links. We add some more links if we can find them, and you know where to find us with your questions if you still have some. Thank you. Have a good morning, afternoon, evening. Sleep well, have a good coffee, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.